The salt hit my face before I reached the gangway, and the smell of diesel and wet rope filled my nostrils like a warning. The steel under my boots was slick with brine, and the deck hummed faintly, a low, vibrating promise that the engines were alive beneath our feet. I had driven through a thunderstorm and 2 toll bridges to get here, and the playlist of reasons I took the job boiled down to one thing: I needed money. The cargo ship towered above the quay like a metal cliff, its white paint weathered into streaks of rust that ran like dried tears. Men and women moved with practiced ease along the railings and through coils of cordage, voices carrying over the slap of waves and the distant beeping of a tug. The man who met me at the gangway had hands like knotted rope, and the sort of stare that had measured 100 horizons. He shoved a folded scrap of paper into my palm and did not smile. It had 6 lines written in a cramped, permanent hand. He said the rules out loud, as if naming them would bind them into work. The 6th made my stomach hollow. Never keep a crate that glows. Keep the windows shut in fog. Cut loose anything that calls your name. He tapped the paper like a priest closing a book and said there was a difference between the sea that took things and the sea that asked for them. I laughed quietly and shoved the paper deep into my jacket because a job was a job and superstition paid nothing. I did not know then how small that scrap of paper would become, the only map I had left. The ship was named the Meridian, and Captain Jensen ran it with a voice like a calendar that had been left in the sun. He showed me the route on a laminated chart, tracing a line from the coast to a dark gray smudge on his map and saying nothing about the weather. Around us, the crew unpacked crates, tightened lashings, and tested winches. There was Maya checking the barometer and muttering about pressure drops, Braden, who kept his favorite cap tucked under his arm, Louise and Ortega arguing about rope technique, Samira humming as she stacked straps, and Ellis, who watched everything like a man cataloging storms. Corey had been the one to hand me the rules. He called himself Corey when he meant it, and Corey when he was angry, and he had the look of someone who had once saved himself from an edge and still counted the cost. The paper was folded thin enough to disappear between my ribs. The first night I slept poorly in the forecastle, I could still feel the rough fold of that paper under my palm like a talisman or a disease. My backstory was small and practical and fit my pockets. I had been raised inland where the sky felt like a lid, and my father drove a delivery van. I learned to fix engines from watching him and took odd gigs after a plant closed and the union stopped answering calls. I moved from small job to smaller, places where the pay stung less and the vacancy notices felt like promises that kept breaking. The sea was not my dream, it was a solution. I left a cheap apartment, 2 boxes of books, and a photo of my sister in a frame that had cracked in the corner. I told myself I could stand anything for a season. I had never been aboard a ship that smelled like metal and weather and something older than the engines. The Meridian offered cash and a shift pattern and the chance to sleep in a bunk that did not creak at every sigh the building took. It seemed honest. My second paragraph of backstory began with the reality of me not being a seaman. I learned quick where the deck buckled and what the lashing meant for balance. I bruised my knuckles on the first day and no one showed mercy. A man named Ellis took it out of my hands and spoke the names of ropes I had never heard, as if reminding them to an old friend. Training was blunt and practical. I learned to secure cargo with ratchet straps, to read the small side windows for tide light, to listen to the hull for sounds that did not belong. Saving money mattered. The ledger at home had numbers and deadlines and no pity. The Meridian paid by the trip, and that meant the more we moved, the closer I got to breathing room. The last paragraph of the backstory was about my sister and the photograph. I kept the frame under my bunk and took it out at odd hours when the ship felt loud and my thoughts crowded the bunk. She had laughed in the picture, eyes squinting, and I promised her a visit when things were steady. The promise sat like an unpaid bill. I told myself the sea would give me time to catch up. I said I would be careful. The rules seemed like a roadside shrine that might or might not save me, but for the first week I treated them like a superstition you respect without believing.
The rules came into focus in the second block, and I read them while the hull thrummed underfoot and gulls argued with the wind. Corey said them again that afternoon as he tightened a knot and spit into the water. He insisted I learn them, and the men around the winch listened because they had skin that had seen salt and suffered, and because on a ship, rules were currency. He listed each one like a ritual. Do not touch unknown crates alone. Never open shipping manifests at night. If something in the hold glows, toss it overboard and mark the coordinates. Close all portholes when the fog comes. Do not answer voices that sound like family. Save your own before you save cargo. When Braden coughed and scoffed, Corey shot him a look that made him go quiet. You do not have to believe, Corey said, but you have to survive. Captain Jensen did not laugh at the rules, nor did he approve them. He gave me a small nod and said he ran a tight ship for a reason. Between plates of cold beans and the clank of cutlery, we discussed shipping lanes, insurance riders, and the odd port that turned down certain kinds of cargo. Samira told a story of an old mate who kept a lantern that burned blue, and everyone shook their heads and changed the subject. The paper went into my pocket, and I slept with its edge pressing under my ribs like a reminder. Days of routine followed, and the sea bent predictability into muscle memory. The winch operators kept the rhythm of hoist and lower. The bosun called orders, and the crew answered in turns. I learned to smell a storm before the barometer dropped, to read the color of the water for the presence of silt, and to feel the ship's mood in the way it rolled. The wind tasted of iron and old bread, and the helm creaked under steady hands. We passed fishing boats and container stacks, and for a short while the sea was ordinary. Maya checked the barometer and noted the pressure falling by fractions. We will need to adjust ballast, she said, measuring the reading with a practiced thumb on the instrument. The day blurred into the next, and small talk kept us steady. Lewis taught me to splice a loop properly, while Ortega cussed softly at my knots. We joked about home, and Braden told a story about a beer he swore tasted like a sunrise when he was 20. The ship felt like a machine with lives stapled to it. The false calm was important because it made the catalyst sharper. On a quiet afternoon when the sun felt like a coin pressed into the surface of the ocean and the horizon was a thin gray line, the winch signaled a catch. We were running a sweep along a known route when the fishing net snagged on something that did not behave like a net should. The deck filled with the smell of salt and algae, the slap of rope, and the metallic tang of something man-made. I was on the line as the barometer ticked lower and the air grew thick with moisture. Then the crate came up. It was small, wooden, waterlogged in places, but the thing that made us fall silent was the light. It pulsed slow and blue from within, like a tiny moon. It was not glow in the way jellyfish glow, diffusing outwards on their skin. It was a steady, internal luminescence that threw our faces into hard blue angles. Samira reached for it, and Corey shoved her hand back like a reflex. The crate's light beat against my retinas, a slow invitation. I remember the sound like a breath. Not the ship, not the sea, but something else under the boards. For a moment the world narrowed to that crate and the rules in my pocket. We argued then in a way that would mark us. We leave it, Corey said. Throw it over. We bring it to deck, Braden said, eyes fixed like someone seeing a debt being paid. We log it, Jensen said, practical like a man reading a ledger. The debate lasted long enough for the crate to pulse again, and for the wind to shift and carry with it a sound that was almost like whispering names. The discovery scene is where I put the CTA to the audience, and where the story asks for a small verdict from those listening. If you had been on that deck and seen something glowing with a light that felt like it wanted to be noticed, what would you have done? Would you have cut the line and watched it drop back into the dark, or kept it and pried it open to see what the sea had brought? If you think the right call was to toss it back, write Team Toss in the comments. If you think someone should have opened it, write Team Open. I read every comment, and the way this community argues has taught me more about fear and curiosity than any handbrake on a winch. The decision on our ship split us into predictable camps. Some believed in the rules as if they were cords that held us to safety. Others thought the sea was a ledger that paid out curiosities if you could cash them. The votes on that comment page will not change what happened to us, but they might tell me if strangers and sailors are farther apart than they say. We kept the crate. We slid it into a container that was meant for non-perishable goods and lashed it between crates of frozen fish and sacks of grain. That night, the ship creaked like a mouth, and the light pulsed faintly through the slats like a secret. Braden could not stop looking at it, and he started to dream out loud in a way that made the crew uneasy. He woke me once in the mess hall and asked if the light had names. "What names?" I asked, rubbing my palms along the cold metal of the table. He spoke of his mother and a childhood farmhouse and a lullaby in a language I did not know. The sensorial details multiplied. The smell of boiled coffee tasted bitter and metallic in my mouth. The deck underfoot felt warm in one place and cold in another. Sounds shifted, footsteps echoed differently. Even the salt on the air seemed thicker. Braden's hands trembled, their own accord, and he began to handle rope like he was touching something alive. The rule about not keeping things that glow sat heavy in my pocket, like a coin that had lost its shine. We tried to follow practical procedure when something felt wrong. For credibility, I will explain what we did to contain it. We wrapped the crate in tarpaulin, secured it with 2 ratchet straps and a spare line, and placed it in a vented container that isolated it from the rest of the cargo. We logged the coordinates of the catch on the manifest and notified Captain Jensen. We monitored the barometer twice an hour and recorded temperature, humidity, and light readings with a handheld meter kept in Maya's kit. Each step was deliberate and meant to appease the ledger we all pretended would protect us. The words were mechanical, and so were our hands as we worked them. The transformation in Braden was where obsession took root. He began to watch the crate the way someone watches a lottery draw. He washed his hands until the skin cracked and the salt on his knuckles bled like paper. He walked the rail at night and said he heard knocking from within the ship, soft at first and then more insistent. He dreamed of a porch light and a child calling his name, of a voice that smelled like cinnamon and old bread. He stopped eating, and when he did pick at food, it tasted like iron and tin. His sleep shrank into fits, and each morning his eyes were recessed like lanterns. The crew noticed. Lewis brought him coffee and tried to joke, but his jokes fell flat. Ortega kept a respectful distance, and Samira stopped singing in the galley. I spoke to Braden in the engine room, leaning against the warmth of the bulkhead. "You are messing with what you believe," I said. "These rules are more than superstition." He looked at me like someone seeing a map that had been folded wrong his whole life. "I am trying to hear it," he said. "It is trying to tell me where I belong." The tension tightened around us. He began to take midnight watches alone, against orders, staring at the horizon like a man waiting for an answer he deserved. This was no longer just about a glowing box. It had become about a claim. 2 moments of high tension must be told in careful detail because they show the change from worry to danger. The first is a night 3 days after the catch. The fog rolled in with a sound like wool across the sea, and the portholes became small moons that did not reflect light. The crate clicked once as the ship rose on a swell, a sound like a throat clearing. Braden was gone from his bunk when the muster was done. We found him at the rail, hands pressed flat to the wood, eyes facing the dark where a shape moved just at the edge of sight. He was humming under his breath, and the sound drew the hair on my arms upright. I felt my throat close. We called his name, and he turned slowly, smile in place like a mask. "They know me," he said. "They know my house." He refused to come down. He swore he heard a voice that pulled like gravity, and for a moment I believed it. The decision to force him below was the first time we showed that we would choose the ship over one of our own. The second tension is 2 nights later when the fog swallowed the ship whole, and the crate began to speak in a way we could not explain. The voices came through the ventilation like a chorus that changed words mid-breath. They sounded like laughter and names and the rustle of paper.
The crew woke to the sound of nails on the hull and the smell of damp linen. Braden was found in the hold with his hands on the crate and his eyes open like someone who had seen beyond the frame of a picture. He whispered coordinates and then began to recite names that were not familiar to any of us. His voice rose until Jensen grabbed his shoulders and screamed his name. Braden turned toward Jensen and smiled with a face that was not familiar to him. The light from the crate swelled, and the doors to the hold banged as if something on the other side pushed. The entire ship felt like a throat that might close. We argued then in full, long lines of desperate talk. Jensen was a man who kept the ship afloat and believed in paper and procedure. "We cannot lose cargo because of ghosts," he said, and the words were edged steel. "We cannot throw away manifest items without record." Corey answered with his hands, the lines on his face like maps. "If you keep it, you keep the price," he said. Braden did not speak. He stared, and when he did speak, it was in riddles. "They are waiting," he said. "They know the way back." The exchanges became fights because the light pressed at our nerves and patience thinned like wet rope. The climax came on a night when the fog coiled around the meridian and the world narrowed to the slap of water and the crate's internal tide. The voices now were not whispers. They had cadence and intent. They sounded like the family of someone singing in a language you almost know, and the creak of the ship responded like a chorus. Jensen ordered the hold sealed, and for a time the deck quieted into the sound of the muffled ocean. Then the lights in the engine room sputtered and went, and the crate pulsed so hard the planks underneath shook. Braden walked up the ladder with each step a small bell. He did not run or stagger. He walked as if returning home. Corey tried to grab him at the top of the ladder, but Braden shrugged, shaking free like a man shedding winter. "I am sorry," he said to no one in particular, and then he stepped into the light. The blue wrapped him, and for a second I saw the outline of a man and a room behind him that did not belong to the meridian. He reached out and touched the railing like a man remembering how to steady himself. Then he was gone. The light winked, and there was a sound like glass shattering in slow motion, and the ladder was empty and wet. The hold where the crate had rested was closed, and when we broke the lock minutes later, the crate was gone. There was only the smell of ozone and a smear of something like salt and ash. The aftermath pushed the ship into action. We searched the logs, we radioed the Coast Guard, and we combed the manifest. Jensen posted a deck watch, and Ellis refused to sleep. Maya took weather readings more often and made notations in a smudged book. We looked for footprints and found none. We checked the rope lockers and found a single wet glove and a smear of blue that no chemical we tried could match. We found nothing of Braden. The ship's record showed a gap of minutes and an entry of a crate that had been carried and then not. There was no sign of a boat launch, and the nearest freighter logged no lights. When the Coast Guard arrived the next day, they asked questions with the policeman's polite disbelief. They dusted for prints and took a report and wrote down coordinates that blurred on their maps like a place trying to forget itself. I told them everything I could. I told them about the crate and the rules and the way Braden laughed in his sleep. They listened with the look of people who have heard things before and cannot put them in a file. In the search, we named the men who mattered because we needed anchors. I could feel names come like ropes thrown to someone lost. Corey took the lead on the deck searches. Jensen coordinated the paperwork and called a meeting. Maya kept a meteorological log and gave a statement to the authorities. Luis and Ortega cleared cargo and checked lashings. Samira kept meals coming and tried to keep the crew steady with small kindnesses. Ellis stood on the bow and watched the sea for hours, mouth tight. Their actions and reactions were specific and threaded through the ship like lifelines. They argued about whether to continue the voyage or to seek immediate port, but in the end, duty and pay and the unknown stitched us to schedule, and we moved on. The crate was gone, and the manifest showed an anomaly that no one could reconcile. The investigation was procedural and clinical.
We recorded manifest numbers. We checked CCTV, though much of it had been offline, and we filed a missing persons report with the nearest harbor. The Coast Guard ran sonar sweeps and dropped a small remotely operated vehicle that filmed nothing but mud. Samples were taken from the place where the crate had sat and sent on for analysis. The procedure was precise. Secure the scene, note timestamps, photograph everything, log temperature and barometric readings at each half hour. The formality made the fear feel smaller because it was boxed in words and check marks. Yet the check marks did not bring Braden back. There were small, permanent consequences. The Meridian's crew refused to speak of the crate in casual tones, and jokes lost their edges. Corey went quiet more often and kept the scrap of paper in his pocket even where it caused a bulge. Jensen put a clause in the log about not transporting unmanifested goods, and the company sent a memo about cargo security and safety protocols. The Coast Guard advised us to toss unknown items when possible and to report anything anomalous to salvage authorities before attempting to store it. Those rules sounded practical, but they also smelled faintly of someone trying to close a door on something they had seen. The epilogue comes in 3 time points, and I will tell them with the distance that months give. 1 month later, I was ashore, and the photograph of my sister felt heavier in my pocket. I had taken shore leave and walked along piers that smelled of varnish and coffee. People on the waterfront talked about market days and the price of fuel, and I carried the paper Corey had given me, folded now into a square, worn soft by touch. The community online had argued in the comments and sent messages with possible explanations ranging from a chemical reaction to stagecraft. I had answers, and none of them fit completely. I kept the memory of Braden's laugh in my mouth like an unchewed seed. The Meridian sailed on, and I went back for another trip because the bills did not wait for ghosts. 3 months later, we were patched into a conference call with company safety officers and a representative from the Marine Institute, who spoke in tempered language about bioluminescence and rare electrolytic reactions in submerged wood. He suggested the crate might have had phosphorescent algae trapped inside, and that agitation could produce light. The theory was plausible, and the data was partial. My nights still smelled faintly of blue and salt, and I started to wake at 3 in the morning as if trained by a bell. I found myself checking portholes in the middle of the day and listening for voices in the clank of the engine. People in the crew took new contracts elsewhere, and the Meridian replaced them with faces that did not know Braden. The rules stayed in Corey's pocket, but the tone had changed. The paper have lived beyond the event.
Like a medicine that made you tell the same story to yourself. 6 months later, I had left the sea for a job in a warehouse on the coast, and the photograph of my sister was on my shelf, not under my bunk. I still carried salt in the seams of my clothes, and sometimes I could taste it on my tongue at breakfast. The memory of the crate had become a map I unfolded at odd times to orient myself. I told the story to friends who leaned in and then asked me practical questions about safety and chain of custody and how we logged cargo. The sea had taken a man and left rules in his place. I kept the scrap of paper folded into the lining of a jacket I wore on cold mornings. It was a reminder that some things that keep you alive are small and simple, and that some things you cannot prove but must respect. I stopped sleeping with the light on, but sometimes I woke to the feeling of a pulse in the room, and for a second I was on the Meridian again, hands on a rail, listening to a voice that sounded like calling. There are a few lessons I carry. The first is that rules are rarely nonsense on a ship. They are shorthand for people who have learned the cost of ignoring weather and telling and not telling. The second is that curiosity can be as dangerous as hunger. The thing that made us human, the need to unwrap the world, nearly cost us a life. The third is that memory is a kind of cargo. We carry it, secure it poorly, and sometimes we lose it overboard. I do not know if the crate belonged to a smuggler, to a natural oddity, or to something older than our classifications. What I do know is this: the sea will hand you small things that glow, and it will ask you to choose. We chose as people always choose, in the middle of fear and need. We kept something we should have let go, and a crewmate stepped into a light and did not return.
Sometimes surviving is not about understanding. It is about listening to a folded piece of paper kept in your pocket and doing what it says, even if you think the sea has changed. If this story made you think of someone you know who works where rules are scrubbed into habit, subscribe and listen for the next account. I read every message, and if you have your own story of something strange at sea, share it. Maybe our small archive of voices becomes a map, a collection of rules that do not fit into a company manual, but keep people alive. The last image I want to leave you with is simple and stubborn. The meridian kept going. The sea took a man and left rules in a pocket and a light that no one could explain. On quiet mornings, I still feel the tug of a horizon that might be a door. I keep the paper folded in my jacket, and sometimes I run my thumb over the crease and imagine the names that floated in the fog. The sea keeps its secrets, and, for now, so do I.